Good evening and welcome to the Australian Citizens Party's live stream webcast this evening. Thanks for joining us. My name is Glenn Isherwood and I'll be the moderator of tonight's proceedings. This is going out across the country, and first thing I want to encourage everyone to do tonight is to get ready with your questions for our candidates that have joined us tonight. We have 7 of the Citizens Party candidates joining us, and the subject matter is an independent foreign policy for sovereignty and security. Perhaps the most significant of these discussions tonight in terms of the implication of the future. So first of all, let me introduce who's on tonight. We have, first of all, Robert Barwick, lead Senate candidate for Victoria. Craig Isherwood, Senate candidate for Victoria. Kingsley Liu, Senate candidate in New South Wales. Anne Lawler, Senate candidate New South Wales. Peter Flynn, Senate candidate for Northern Territory. Thong Sum Lee, candidate for the lower house seat of Lingiari. And finally, but not least, Russell Francis from South Australia, Senate candidate for SA. So first of all, I want to throw over to Robert Barwick to give some opening remarks on this question of foreign policy for sovereignty and security. We'll then get stuck into the Q&A. But first of all, to ask your questions to the panel this evening, send them along to ask@citizensparty.org.au. And for more details about the broad 15-point policy program that we are running on this election, I would encourage you to go to the Citizens Party Election 2022 page. You'll be able to see videos of our candidates. You'll be able to see detailed, elaborated points of the 15-point program, and there's more being added each day as we engage in the hustings. So first of all, I would like to now throw to Senate candidate Robert Barwick to give some opening remarks. Thank you, Robbie.
Thanks, Glenn. When the Citizens Party scheduled this live stream a few weeks ago, before Easter, we couldn't have predicted just how topical and timely it would be for the election campaign, given the events of this week, which I'll talk about in a minute. For years, going back to at least 2011, our party has warned that the direction of Australia's foreign policy has been towards an unthinkable war with China. In 2012, a senior statesman of Australia, the late former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, issued his own stark warning of war with China, a war which he warned would be nuclear. I and the Australian Citizens Party leader, Craig Isherwood, my fellow Senate candidate, we met with Malcolm Fraser on our shared concern, and that began a productive collaboration until his death in 2015. Our warnings were based on predicting the consequences of the United States President Barack Obama's Asia pivot, which he announced in Australia in 2011. What Obama announced in that policy was essentially this. The United States was saying the Middle East was no longer a priority for it, after having literally destroyed the region through multiple wars, turned it into a hellscape. It's that Middle East is no longer a priority. We are going to pivot to Asia, where our priority is confronting a rising China. And as a consequence of that decision, the United States deployed 60% of its military power to surround and contain China, but actually confront China. This deployment included US Marines being based in Darwin, within rapid deployment distance of being able to choke off the Straits of Malacca, which China relied on for its oil supply. I want to point out something very important about the timing of this. Xi Jinping was not president of China at this time. So much of what we've heard in recent years has been focused on demonizing the personality of Xi Jinping. like he's some uniquely autocratic leader of China, from whom we must respond because he has this expansionary view of the world. This decision, the Asia pivot, was before Xi Jinping. It was also before China had built up any islands in the South China Sea and begun militarizing the islands, which we have consistently denounced as proof of an expansionist, aggressive China. China started doing that subsequently. The Asia pivot, the deployment of US Marines to Darwin happened first. Western politicians, though, have been screaming ever since, as I said, about this expansionism of China. There was a curious contradiction for a long time, though. Our politicians, because of their subservience to the United States and the United Kingdom, which we'll talk about more tonight, I'm sure, went along with this hysteria about China's supposed intent in this expansionism. But contradicting that, the same politicians expressed incredible enthusiasm for Australia's trade relationship, which was growing with China. And that enthusiasm was justified. China is our biggest and our best customer. We profit to the tune of $70 billion per year from that trade. That is the surplus that is in our favor. By contrast, we have a trade deficit with the United States of $30 billion. That's $30 billion that leads our country every year that we don't get back. America profits from it. China, our supposed adversary, we profit from that relationship. And the trade grew and grew and grew. And there are many wine growers and beef producers and lobster fishermen and all sorts of other exporters who have enjoyed an incredible bounty from that trade with China. And our politicians were very enthusiastic about it for a long time, to the point where in 2015, Australia joined China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, against the wishes of the United States. Our politicians, it's the last time I've seen this, our politicians effectively defied the wishes of the United States to join the AIIB, as many other countries did around the world. That same year, in 2015, Xi Jinping visited Australia and addressed our parliament and signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with our country, which still exists on paper. On paper, Australia and China are comprehensive strategic partners. And remember that when I play Peter Dutton's comments in a few minutes. In 2017, the Turnbull government, in the person of Trade Minister then, Steve Ciobo, was positively gushing in welcoming the Belt and Road Initiative and Australia's participation in that. And it wasn't the only one. State governments were equally enthusiastic. I'd like to read a couple of quotes from one from Richard Marles, the current deputy opposition leader, in 2017, for which he's being demonised right now in the Murdoch press, as if somehow this means he's some kind of Manchurian candidate. But everyone was saying this at the time. He just put it particularly well. He praised, rightly, in my opinion, quote, the really significant contribution that China is making to humanity, which I described is the single biggest alleviation of poverty in human history. That was 2017. As recently as 2019, our current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, he declared, quote, Australia welcomes the contribution that the Belt and Road Initiative can make to regional infrastructure investment and to regional development. This was, by today's standards, extraordinary, but it was consistent with the Australian government's position for a long time. So what happened? The Citizens Party has documented this. I could talk for hours on this subject. There's a series of articles on our website, though, that you could look up called the China Narrative. And what we have documented in that series, that 5-part series, principally written by researcher Melissa Harrison, is how the United States and the United Kingdom, through their intelligence partnership called the Five Eyes, having already made a strategic decision in Washington that China was going to be, at all costs, the principal strategic adversary, set about making sure Australia towed the line on that position and removed this contradiction between our strategic language and our trade and our enthusiasm for our trade. The Five Eyes agency, ASIO, was a principal driver of this in Australia. ASIO connected media and politicians, began beating the drums of war in Parliament. In 2018, there was a significant phase shift when an academic named Clive Hamilton published an exceedingly disgusting, racist book called Silent Invasion, in which he asserted with zero evidence that 30% of Australia's Chinese community was somehow loyal to Beijing, to give the Australian public the idea that in this silent invasion that would precede the rhetoric of a serious invasion, their Chinese neighbor might rise up against them and fight on behalf of the Chinese communists. That's the purpose of that book. It fueled the most extreme xenophobia and paranoia that has taken control of this relationship. You have a think tank in Canberra that has been pumping out the most aggressive disinformation to demonize all things to do with China and lie about everything China does and its intentions. And that think tank is nominally an Australian organisation called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. However, it is funded by the United States State Department, other governments like the British government, the Dutch government, and the Japanese government, and the world's biggest and most profitable weapons manufacturers, who've only made more profits thanks to the policies the Australian government has had to adopt in response to ASPI's, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's disinformation. You had politicians in the parliament who are principally loyal to the United States and the United Kingdom, not Australia. And their names are people like Andrew Hastie, James Patterson, the late Kimberley Kitching. They are in bed with organisations like the Henry Jackson Society in the United Kingdom, extreme neoconservatives who advocate war for the spread of liberal democracy. That is their whole modus operandi, to use the smokescreen of liberal democracy as a pretext to justify never-ending wars. That's their ethos. In my view, one of the most evil organisations in the world, the Henry Jackson Society. These politicians in Australia disseminate their material. They also happen to monopolise the Australian committee in Parliament, the parliamentary committee that oversees the intelligence agencies, which are under the thumb of these Five Eyes, their Five Eyes masters in the US and UK. Their only oversight in Australia is this parliamentary committee, and that committee is dominated by people of like mind who are their fellow travellers and associated with the same Henry Jackson Society. They call themselves the Wolverines, and we can get into more about that later. As a result of the activities, the intense activities of all these people, in the context especially of the Trump administration, and not so much Trump himself, though Trump's rhetoric was vile, but Trump's appointments like Mike Pompeo and Peter Navarro and John Bolton, Australia began to conform on all fronts and march in lockstep with this agenda. And suddenly, in the space of 2 or 3 years, they have shifted public opinion so that whereas in 2017, opinion polls showed 40% of Australians were somewhat anti-China or would have said they feared China, now it's well over 80% of Australians say they're anti-China. And that's a very rapid shift in just a few years. And it's all been directed by this external operation that we've identified in this series I urge everyone to read. That brings us to this week and what we're going to talk, why it's so important we're having this meeting tonight. I personally did not think it could possibly get any worse than it had until this week, until Anzac Day, until our Defence Minister got on Channel 9 and said this. Play the tape, please, Aaron.
The Prime Minister this morning in Darwin also mentioned this new threat. The arc of autocracy, he called it when he addressed the huge crowds that were in Darwin. Tell us about that and your main concerns in regard to that on this Anzac Day.
Well, Carl, I just think that's the reality of our time, and we have to have a proper understanding of it. We have to have a conversation and really be frank about the intelligence and the advice that we're receiving and reading. And as I say, we shouldn't take for granted that the sacrifice that was made by the Anzacs or those in World War II or in Vietnam, in the Middle East, in every conflict in between, that somehow that will, see us through to eternity without conflict in our region. We have to be realistic that people like Hitler and others aren't just a figment of our imagination or that they're consigned to history. We have in President Putin at the moment somebody who's willing to kill women and children, and that's happening in the year 2022, and I think Europe's really been startled by what's happened there. It's a replay in part of what's happened in the 1930s, and you don't need to over-egg it. The Chinese are, through their actions, through their words, on a very deliberate course at the moment, and we have to stand up with countries to stare down any act of aggression to make sure that we can keep peace in our region and for our country. How are you going to handle that? Because, look, I know it's difficult to talk about this on Anzac Day, but it is happening. You're setting up a red line in the Solomons. I'm sure our diggers, it sends a shiver down their spine when they look at the potential of all of this. But how will you possibly stop it? Well, Carl, the only way that you can preserve peace is to prepare for war and to be strong as a country, not to cower, not to be on bended knee and be weak. That's the reality.
You heard it yourself. Our Defence Minister, in his own words, has said, we are preparing for war. Those were his words. You can't sugarcoat something like that. There's a lot of things you could say about that clip I've just played. Some will come up in the discussion. I do want to point out, though, this is a favourite ploy by Western politicians to start talking about Russia and China in the context of Adolf Hitler. It is the single most deliberately insulting thing they can do. Those are two countries that lost tens of millions of people in World War II fighting the German fascists and the Japanese fascists. And they do it deliberately. They want a conflict. Now, that's Peter Dutton. I regard him as probably the most sinister politician of our age. I call him Darth Vader without a helmet. Usually, a democracy would have an opposition, and it's the job of the opposition to oppose. And especially when someone is such an extremist, to take them to task for their extremism. Peter Dutton's counterpart, in this case, the person who was wheeled out from the Labor Party, was Penny Wong. Such is the climate in Australia today. Penny Wong did not take on Peter Dutton and his inciting language. She tried to hype up this fictitious threat even more, as you'll see in this clip.
Let's be clear, the prospect of a Chinese base less than 2,000 kilometres from Australia's coastline is dramatically detrimental to Australia's security interests.
Again, we can probably talk about some more of that later, but let's be clear, what she said, what the Prime Minister has said when he called the Solomon Islands our red line, even though there is no military base there is no agreement for a military base, we are calling it a red line. She is describing it in those terms, has just undone every bit of propagandistic condemnation those same Australian politicians have heaped on Vladimir Putin for the last 2 months. Because if we are going to call the Solomon Islands our red line against a country that hasn't invaded anybody, then you better believe that Vladimir Putin was more than justified in calling Ukraine a red line against NATO, which is dripping in blood from 20 years of non-stop war started on lies. Let's be clear about this. Our politicians are supremely hypocritical, but how can they be so, how has it come to this? How are they prepared to be so shameless? Well, on the one hand, they're appealing to this shift in public opinion that is somehow they think it's popular to appeal for votes by threatening war. On the other hand, they are dancing to the tune of foreign powers. When Scott Morrison called the Solomon Islands our red line, he said, I share the United States red line on this. It's not our red line. It's our big allies' red line. I want to play just the final 2 clips before we go to questions, which is a second part of Peter Dutton's interview where this comes up, and listen to their language. This has nothing to do with Australian sovereignty, a sovereign Australian position. They're constantly referring to where the real interests, whose interests are really at issue here. And then following Peter Dutton, we're going to play a clip from the project on Channel 10 two nights ago. And when I watched this question from Waleed Ali, I thought, finally, someone in the mainstream media is asking the right question. It's the only person in the mainstream media I've seen ask the right question, and he only asked it once. We're not going to play the answer because the politician, she couldn't answer the question. Christine, this is a question to Christina Keneally. She couldn't answer the question. We will answer the question tonight. So please play those last 2 clips, Aaron.
With the US, your US counterparts, how concerned were they about what happened in the Solomons, about you being the eyes and the ears in the South Pacific and not knowing?
Well, it wasn't about not knowing, Carl. I mean, we'd had lots of intelligence and we worked through that intelligence with our partners, and it points to a disturbing development, but it's not our country that's changed. We have a very strong relationship. You're not hearing the Solomons Prime Minister say that he has any problem at all with Australia. He says that we're the most important partner, but the Chinese operate by very different rules, and they do it here, they do it in Africa, they do it in other parts of the world. We're seeing in Sri Lanka, you're seeing now 20 points of military presence in the South China Sea, and amassing of nuclear weapons by China. They're building more on a tonnage rate in their Navy every 18 months than the entire Royal Australian Navy. So yes, I mean, the Americans are concerned, the Brits are concerned. In the South China Sea, the Chinese militia are bumping up against the Japanese Coast Guards on a daily basis. It's not Japan that's changed. In India, on the land border, as you know, the Indian troops have been killed at the hands of Chinese troops over the last 3 years. So this is a very concerning period, and Australia will stand proud and strong, and we want a normalised relationship with China as quickly as possible. But these acts of aggression that we're seeing at the moment aren't acceptable to our country or to countries that stand for what we stand for.
You're right, this is about the whole of the South Pacific. It's also really more about the United States than it seems to be about us. And I want to draw you on that because the US, in the middle of last year, they announced a new military base in the Federated States of Micronesia. They're planning to extend these compacts that they have with 3 different North Pacific states that allow for free military movement across those countries and include military installations. And looking at that, China would probably, understandably, say, well, hang on, if you're going to up your presence, we're going to up ours. Do you hold the view that America is the only country in the world that is entitled to establish a military presence across a region like this?
Thanks, Aaron. So let us tonight answer Waleed Ali's question. Over to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Robbie. I know you've put out a lot there that is going to cause everyone to sit up a little bit and hopefully reflect one of the greatest challenges in life, I suppose, is to put oneself in another's shoes and look at this from a different perspective, and somewhere along the line find the truth. And an interesting point that's been highlighted by us for some time is there is nothing in this country that obligates a politician to speak the truth. If they wish to manipulate, they will, and they have openly admitted it. So I want to throw this open to all the candidates now. For those who have questions for the candidates present this evening, again, that email is ask@citizensparty.org.au. It's on the screen there. And this first question comes from Alexis in New South Wales. It's actually a series of 3 questions. The first of which is, how would the Citizens Party handle the Solomon Islands issue? Second, what would be the 3 main foreign policy objectives of the Citizens Party should they have a term in government? And how would the Citizens Party measure the success of those objectives at the end of a 3-year term or 3-year period? And the third question, how would the Citizens Party decouple from the United States and the UK influences in Australia's foreign policy? So there's a bit there in those 3 questions. I took them slow, yeah.
Well, I propose. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. They are rather involved, so I propose that anyone feel free to chip in with their observations, actually, because some of this is going to be informed by things like the discussion that we have tonight. Just first on the Solomons question, and this goes to Waleed Ali's question. We need to change the terms in which this whole discussion is framed, and we need to start by respecting the sovereignty of other nations. It's hard for Australia to respect the sovereignty of other nations, though, because we don't have any ourselves, and that's a fundamental problem for Australia. We have deliberately chosen to bow the knee for more than a century to foreign allies when it comes to foreign policy. And in fact, early Australia was so subservient to the UK that when the UK passed this Act of Parliament, the UK ran our foreign policy until the 1940s, but it passed an Act of Parliament in the 1930s to allow us to run our own foreign policy, and we declined. It wasn't until John Curtin became Prime Minister that we took over our own foreign policy. Since in the latter period, the subservience to the United States is very, very dominant, especially in military terms. So we have a real problem there, and I think it's one of the reasons that we can't look at a country like the Solomon Islands and actually respect its sovereignty. It has made a sovereign decision. It has a security deal with Australia, where it can call in Australia to help with its security concerns if they become an issue. But the security concerns are more than these things include, local riots and etc., where they might call for peacekeepers. But it's also things as simple as the problems that come after a massive cyclone or whatever. And China has become a good partner to the Solomon Islands. And so the Solomon Islands has made a sovereign decision to sign a similar security deal with China. It doesn't constitute a military base. Sogavari, the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, assures us it's not a military base. This is one time I know I can believe Scott Morrison. Poor old Scott, for once, in order to protect himself against the political attacks he's coming under, because the Labor Party sees this as a point of attack, because it looks like he's lost the Solomons on behalf of the United States, Scott's saying, no, he's assuring us it's not a military base. Well, it's true, it's not. So stop hyping it up as if it is one. And the real problem here is that Australia sees itself in the Pacific, as it has expressed in the past, as the deputy sheriff to the United States. And when something like this happens, we act all embarrassed, as if we've let the United States down. And believe me, the United States thinks we've let them down, because the man who was the architect of the Asia pivot, Kurt Campbell, Obama's architect of the Asia pivot, is the guy who went to the Solomons this week to eyeball them, to make them to express America's extreme dissatisfaction with this deal. So America is unhappy, but the question that we have to answer as a sovereign country is the dominant economy in our region, which hasn't invaded anybody, which, by the way, is a 5,000-year-old culture that deserves respect for being a mainstay of global civilization for thousands of years. Does that country, now that it's back on its feet after having gone through a period of extreme, what do they call it, the century of humiliation at colonial powers, which included being collapsed into extreme poverty, now that China is back on its feet and is some way towards finding the economic position it had pre-colonialism, when it was about a quarter of the world's economy, why does China not have the right to do deals like this with countries around the world? Why do we think as a country that it's our job to support America's asserting just purely imperialistic claims in this region? So if we stop thinking that way and change the frames of reference, respect the Solomon Islands sovereignty, and then actually looked at what can be accomplished here with this kind of cooperation, which China is building a track record of right around the world through the Belt and Road Initiative, we would actually, I think, see the benefit for the Solomons in this deal, for us in this deal, and see the greater benefit in taking a cooperative approach to China economically rather than this hostile one.
Thank you.
I agree with Robbie's comments. I believe that there are no concrete evidence to prove that China is going to put in a naval base. There's no such thing as a naval base. It's just a cooperation between two governments to control the people in times of flood or in public chaos, like demonstration that we have seen recently. So without evidence, without any proof, we should just regard our ministers like Peter Dutton to be under the influence of the USA administration and the military-industrial complex. I would not be dreaming over the issues of Solomon's Islands. I'll just let it rest and just regard it as another election issue that they are now drumming to win power again.
Thank you, Thong. Over to you, Craig.
Yeah, well, there's three issues here that I wanted to raise because to endorse what Robbie was saying, because this comes down to a real big battle at the moment in Australian politics between ideologies, I should say. And what we see coming to the fore right now is this ideology of the survival of the fittest type ideology in regional affairs. And instead of our philosophy as a political party, which is peace through economic development, the concept of win-win, of working alongside our partners to solve things and to work together, you have this rampant pro-war, proxy war type ideology that's starting to come forward big time. And I also want to do something rather unique in this program, is that I want to call Clive Palmer and Drew Pavlov out as to be fundamental liars. Because last Saturday at an event in Queensland, both Drew Pavlov and Clive Palmer came out and said that the Citizens Party gets money from China. Now, as a founder of the organisation, the National Secretary, Treasurer and the Registered Officer, I can categorically say that we have never received 1 cent from any foreign government anywhere in the world at any time. And it's a fundamental slander on ordinary Australians that have supported our organisation for over 34 years, that they would want to come out and show their fundamental ignorance about what they're actually talking about. But this is what you're getting in politics today, where the quality of those people that are standing up to represent the people of Australia are absolute fundamental idiots. They have no fundamentally decent intelligence behind them. They don't know what they're talking about, but because of ideology, because of this idea that they somehow think that in stoking up the rage of ordinary Australians, who are enraged, by the way, because the cost of living is going through the roof, things aren't working, because they are enraged, and they've got to have good reason to be enraged, they are becoming entrapped into these sorts of lies. So the policy direction that our organisation represents, like this idea of peace through economic development, which we've never changed from, we've never deviated from this in the entire life of our organisation, becomes called into question because you've got these liars that choose to use cheap political stunts to do it. Now, what is the issue with China? Well, I'm 62, so I've been around for a fair while. Like, I was involved in politics back in, the late 80s. And I know that in the late 70s, 80s and so forth, when countries reached out for economic development, there was only 2 choices, the World Bank and the IMF. And if countries went to those, as is happening right now, in fact, this very week, Sri Lanka went to the World Bank and the IMF at a sideline of a conference recently. And the IMF says, yes, because the Sri Lanka is looking at sovereign default, because it's got it can't pay for fuel, it can't pay for food, it can't pay for medicines. So it's defaulting on its sovereign debt, as are right now 19 other countries, according to the IMF. So what's happened is that the IMF said, oh, yes, we'll give you some money, we'll help you out, but you have to follow our conditionalities. Right, so this is the Western way of doing things, just like Morrison and what we're saying to Solomon Islands. Oh, yes, we'll help you out, but you have to follow the way that we do things. Get back into line, you naughty schoolboy. That's how they treat people. But there's a new paradigm on the block, and it's China. In the last 10 to 15 years, it's developed itself internally through national banking, dirigistic type policies. It's lifted millions upon millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, so that the Chinese people actually support their government, unlike ours, to the point that they want to keep this process going because their standard of living is increasing. And countries around the world are starting to notice, are we going to put up with this? Are we going to put up with this big bully like the United States and consequently like Australia as well? Are we going to put up with, or are we going to start to form strategic alliances with countries that can actually help us? Right, and then what happens in the Western countries like our own is that, oh, no, there's strings attached. China couldn't possibly want to do this with no strings attached because we're not used to having no strings attached. That couldn't be possible. Well, it is, because China's never invaded another country, ever, unlike the United States, never fomented wars, never put military weapons around the outskirts of countries like Russia, like you've seen in Europe. So there's a completely different paradigm on the block. And then when you see countries that are offered financial support for the purposes of their own internal development, like other 140 other countries around the world, they say, yes, please. We can't tolerate this old paradigm of the IMF World Bank conditionalities where they actually make us poorer, that we can't develop our internal economies. No, we have to have a different choice. So there's a real tension. This is what you're seeing. This is why we're getting pushed into World War III right now, is because the Western way of doing things is coming to the end of its road. And this is why it's getting exceptionally dangerous about World War III. Because I don't know that bastards in the United States that are doing this and pushing this, these neoconservatives, they go up and say, oh, shit, we've lost the battle now, let's just blow everything up. This is how crazy these people are. This is not a rational argument, right? And when you see these attacks on us by Clive Palmer and Jude Pavlov, you realise how insane this process actually is. And, we've been around for a long time. We've seen this, and the solution is very much on the table. It's there right in front of our faces. And 3-4 years ago, we could see our existing leaders embrace this idea. Dan Andrews here in Victoria was saying, yes, let's have a memorandum of understanding of how we can collaborate with the Belt and Road. Morrison himself said it was a good idea to look at economic development, infrastructure, and so forth. The paradigm's come around from what Robbie has said. And this is the battle confronting all Australians. Now, get a lot smarter in thinking about things in terms of history. China is 5,000 years old. And, we're barely off the blocks. I mean, we've been barely around for 200 years in this country. So I think that this particular discussion tonight is very important in trying to reset at least and give some balance to the complete and utter craziness that's enveloped our country and particularly this election campaign. And that's what a Citizens Party represents. And we've got detailed policies in this in terms of peace through economic development. We haven't wavered. In fact, we had an entire conference on this in 2015, which is available on our website. If people want to have a look at that, have a look at it. It's all there in black and white 7 years ago.
Thank you, Craig. Over to Kingsley Liu, Senate candidate in New South Wales. Take it away.
Yeah, I'd like to raise 3 issues that come out of this tonight. First, I'll talk about where China is in the north-south states of how it is risen to such a powerful leader in the leadership stakes. Then I'll address Walid Ali, and then I'll talk about a Sri Lankan, the real facts around Sri Lanka, which Peter Dutton referred to in rather diminishing terms. So I was at the United Nations in 1972. That evening, when China joined the United Nations, it was a very poor country. However, what it has achieved was extremely impressive since then. It's alleviated poverty. It's brought in education to very high levels across the country, and the main thing is now a leader in steel production, manufacturing, electrical production, and many key areas as a very impressive economy in its own right. This has earned it respect across many countries, in such that there's now its leadership, particularly in current crisis at the moment, where China and a number of countries are opting not to take sides. I believe that's a very powerful force it's taking in the world to bring about peace in Ukraine. We need to see that war stopped. But the best way to do it is not to take sides. And China has led the world in that regard. So because it's so impressive, it has got lots of friends. And many countries have joined the Belt Road Initiative. And in particular, what the Solomon Islands has done is actually now develop an economy of which about 80% is involved with China, both import and export. It has a lot to protect that economy because it's a small island economy in many islands. It has a right to defend its sovereignty and get protection from people that have its interest with. And it has done so. But when we talk about Walid Ali's issues that he raised, what we have is a monopolistic power, certainly in military terms, but a declining power because its business model is not succeeding against China. China's reached out and created a business model on a very much a win-win basis, and the world has taken up on it. It's brought itself into a position of parity with USA and is expected to exceed it. Certainly in another 10 years, it will be have a GDP exceeding that of USA. So what we see, what Walid Ali was raising the spectre of a South American type strategy where America would come in and develop its gunboat policy by engaging with government in such a way that they could get them to bend to their hegemony interest. So what's happened in Solomon Islands is we have a spectre, a possibility of two competing parts of the country. One is Malaita and the other one is Honiara in the Guadalcanal area, island. And we're going to see two competing security policies, pacts, with Australia and in China. And we are likely to see a high level of foreign influence by Australia in the Solomon Islands to defy their sovereignty and their rights. So I just see that what's playing out is Australia is going to get its hands extremely dirty as it continues, particularly if both Labor and Liberal are following very similar policies. But the last thing I want to talk about is what Dutton talked about is Sri Lanka, and with its implications about China. What we have is that China gave development loans to Sri Lanka, and yes, they are debt loans, but those loans have created collateral that's located in the lender's own property in the island of Sri Lanka. So there's no way China can actually take out that collateral and say, look, give us back your port, because that port is owned by Sri Lanka. It is funded by China. Also, that China is the main tenant and is leasing that property. And I would say that but being both lender and tenant is a hell of a good way to help your friend develop their country. And Sri Lanka will be able to develop good two-way trade with China. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. They're just my impressions. And thanks for the opportunity.
Anne Lawler, New South Wales.
Yeah, I just want to, I suppose, look at the comparison between what China is doing today, which and how America developed.
You've just become muted,
Muted.
Suddenly. Just 1 second while we fix that.
No, she's all good now.
Okay, go ahead. Just backtrack 5 seconds.
Okay, well, back. I want to look at the policies that we represent as a political party, the idea of national banking, infrastructure development, the role that government plays in ensuring that we have the infrastructure and the utilities available to develop and to, in a sense, have a system of entrepreneurship. That's the principles or the policies that made Australia great. When you go back and look at the founding fathers, when you look at the principle of what Franklin Roosevelt represented to get America out of the Depression and actually to fight a war against fascism. China have adopted those principles today. That's the principles of what the Belt and Road is built on. They've got state banks, they've got state enterprises. Their focus is on building up infrastructure and working on how they lift their people out of poverty. That now is what the United States, it's like you've got one coming up and one going down. And so therefore the United States and the UK and the Western powers that have got such a casino economy, all we want to invest in is how do we put more money in to keep the banks, gambling and running as a casino, which is literally starving our physical productive economies, whereas they're investing in the physical productive economy of their country and of other countries. And that was the principle that the United States worked on once upon a time. The idea of, prosper thy neighbour. You're not going to, what's the point of having countries around you that have got to rely on foreign aid or assistance? Why not help them to be productive in their own right, and then you can trade with them and everybody benefits in the region. So I just want to add that, contrast in there of what's going on today.
Thanks, Anne. So these next questions pertain to the subject of sovereignty and international organisations. This one comes from Elizabeth in New South Wales. She says, I'm not clear about the current role of the United Nations. It comes under a lot of attack for allowing the undermining of national sovereignty. The latest regarding a World Health Organization agreement and the health rights of individuals. I know the United Nations was set up in 1945 by 50 countries with the intention of preventing another world war like the one they had just experienced. With the world edging closer to another major war, where is the United Nations? Has the United Nations lost its purpose, been infiltrated, or fallen victim to the fake news propagandists?
If I can start, I urge people to read the UN Charter, the original UN Charter. It's a very good document. It's one of the it's the cornerstone of international law at the moment. It enshrines the principle of national sovereignty and things like non-interference in other countries' affairs. But the United Nations was formed at the end of the worst war in human history, World War II, with a view to trying to avert such wars in the future. It hasn't been perfect, but the United Nations as a meeting of the world's nations and governments, and the role of the UN Security Council, which I think, my personal view of it, is the main criticism you'd make of the makeup of the Security Council is which are the countries that are on it at the moment, because France and Britain no longer deserve their status as permanent members of the Security Council. They probably should be replaced by Brazil and India, as if you want to be truly representative of the world's population. But nevertheless, there's been numerous times that those institutions have stood between the world and world war, because the countries that can start a world war do want the imprimatur of international law on their side. So it hasn't stopped them, especially the United States, starting war without UN approval. But when they do, no one's under any doubt that these are wars that are not endorsed by the United Nations. Because essentially any war the UN doesn't approve is an illegal war. And that's what the Iraq War was. And the Americans will never be able to shirk the fact that the Iraq War was an illegal war. And likewise, so is Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It's technically an illegal war. But Vladimir Putin didn't start the process of trashing the United Nations. The United States did. One of the most fateful things the United States ever did was lie to the Russians to get the Russians to support the no-fly zone over Libya in 2011. And Barack Obama assured then President Medvedev that it wouldn't become a regime change operation. And Vladimir Putin, those were the 5 years in which Vladimir Putin was the prime minister, having stood aside from being president. And as prime minister, he warned his president that you couldn't trust that promise, and he was proved correct. And the Russians have not trusted the United States and the Brits in the Security Council ever since. I remember our former foreign minister, Julie Bishop, railing about how the Russians have made the UN Security Council dysfunctional. No, they didn't. They just began vetoing everything because that 2011 intervention into Libya, which destroyed one of the most advanced countries in Africa, to this day, it's turned it into an absolute basket case of a nation, a failed state that's a haven for terrorism and slave traders, where before it was a very advanced country. Russia's never going to make that mistake again. And that's on America, that's not on Russia. But so with those imperfections, the UN Security Council and the United Nations as an institution have nevertheless played an important role in international law and in creating a tension towards peace, a pressure for peace. You do separate that from, in terms of the way the question is posed, you do have to separate that part of the UN from the various bureaucracies and UN agencies that have sprung up over the years. And they become captive to all kinds of agendas. Those agendas largely get referred to as, globalist agendas. The UN becomes a very useful vehicle to push that and tell. It sort of uses a bit of a bluff, though. They tell countries like Australia, see, this is endorsed by the UN. That's why you've got to toe the line. Well, the UN actually can't dictate to a country like Australia, we have to do these things. That's what we've got to do. What is required for these things to become law is our parliamentarians to pass them as laws. But they use those, the global, these UN agencies and forums become vehicles for global campaigns to push certain agendas. And that is something that keeps popping up. There's a reason people are very suspicious of the UN. However, separate that from the actual purpose of the UN, which is the way the Security Council works and the UN General Assembly works as a meeting of the world's governments, because that part, I think we still have to preserve it, and it was well-intentioned.
Thanks, Robbie. Russell Francis in South Australia.
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks for the question. I'm of the view that the United Nations is a potentially best option that the world has or has had since the end of the Second World War to be able to rationally deal with all of the complexities that beset the planet. The thing is that's happened, I think, since the end of the Cold War is that instead of there being a peace dividend where all the armies of the world could have packed up and gone home and NATO could have been diminished and the world could have experienced a peace dividend, the intensity of competition within the Security Council was diminished by the fact that the Soviet Union was no more and it was a diminished power in itself, and by extension, China as well. And then the remaining powers, the so-called victorious powers in the Cold War, I think just saw the United Nations as something that they were in charge of. And by extension, they then decided to be in charge of the entire world. And so ever since that time, sort of beginning in the 90s, you've had them kind of marching across the world in their triumphalism, winning the Cold War, and invading countries left, right and centre. I guess the first one that springs to mind right now is the bombing of Serbia and Yugoslavia, I should say. It was Yugoslavia existed at the time. And, they bombed that country to smithereens and balkanised it and created, a foothold in that part of the world for their troops to, again, put a gun to the head of Eurasia and Russia. So even though the United Nations has had a diminished role in terms of world security, and it's been somewhat, corrupted by, I think, corrupt players, the United States and Great Britain and some of their European allies. If we can survive, and I say that in all seriousness, if we can survive what's going on at the moment, and that a peace can be restored without the world going to war, and I don't even want to think about there being a nuclear war. But if we can survive this, then I believe that the United Nations and the Security Council will be injected with a new appreciation of the fact, the real fact, that China and Russia are real economies with real civilizational power. And no matter how insane the Anglo-Americans and their friends are in the Security Council, they simply won't be able to just bludgeon their way around the world anymore. So I'm advocating that there's still hope for the UN, and we should look forward to that and try and strive to make sure that it's made robust again, particularly at the Security Council level. And thanks for the question.
Thanks, Russell. Kingsley.
United Nations is probably the best way of creating a bridge between the North and the developing South, and what we now see is the polarizing of the East and the West. It seems the only bridge we have out there that we can rely on to get a pathway to peace, particularly on Ukraine. If they can't directly come through peace negotiations, the UN may be able to have some input in this. But also, UN has peacekeeping operations. It deals through health, through WHO, poverty, food shortages. And of course, yes, it has been a forum for global lies like weapons of mass destruction. Nevertheless, it is our only chance that we have at the moment. And it's really interesting how the votes of the United Nations are played out on a world stage. Public opinion can be swayed by the way the United Nations votes and how each individual country has a say in global affairs. Thank you.
This next question comes from Eric. And this, he says, how can Australia get out of the Five Eyes, and would you make this part of your platform?
Well, it's certainly our policy. We haven't included it in the fighting platform, but it's certainly our policy. You have to understand that our involvement in the Five Eyes is through our various intelligence agencies. And there was a time we didn't have those agencies and we survived fine. In fact, those agencies were started after World War II. World War II was the period of greatest threat to Australia. We didn't have ASIO, we didn't have ASIS, we didn't have, what's now the Australian Signals Directorate was would have had a military origin in World War II, because that's real intelligence, looking for the signals, trying to spy on the signals intelligence of your enemy. Is much less sophisticated back then, of course. So the predecessor of that would have existed. But when the way ASIO started as MI5 came to Australia and essentially demanded the Chifley government start ASIO with a threat that the British government would not share intelligence with Australia unless we had a dedicated intelligence agency. And Ben Chifley opposed it. He saw straight away that ASIO might become a secret police. Anyway, long story short, after various shenanigans, he was persuaded to actually start ASIO in 1949. ASIO quickly entered into this agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom, which in those days was called Echelon, for intelligence sharing. This was the beginning of Five Eyes. To me, the single most interesting fact about Five Eyes, or that predecessor agreement, is when Gough Whitlam became Prime Minister in 1972, and his Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, raided ASIO. The Whitlam government was unaware that ASIO was in this agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom that is now Five Eyes. They didn't know that existed. In other words, that agreement was superseded the authority and sovereignty of our country. And that's the problem with it. Even the most benign form, if you have intelligence agencies that are allowed to operate in secret, which is their purview, you are carving out an area of government that is off limits to democratic accountability. Now, we're supposed to have these systems like a parliamentary committee on intelligence and security, which we have. But that right now, as I said in my opening remarks, is stacked by the people who are loyal to the Five Eyes. It's no oversight at all. And then with these modern politicians, none of them are going to question this. They won't like Chifley to instinctively question, well, we've survived this far without a spy agency. Why do we need one? They just assume that this exists. It exists very importantly. Five Eyes is all important, and they shouldn't ask questions about it. And by definition, that sits above the authority and any democratic accountability of Australia. And if we believe in sovereignty, we shouldn't have that. And I think a Citizens Party government would totally re-examine the role of the intelligence agencies in Australia, see if they're fit for purpose, bring in honest brokers to actually do the investigation of that, and withdraw from any Five Eyes agreements. We would not do this, and there's no point. There would be no need to do this in a hostile way to the United States and the United Kingdom. We can tell them we'll still be friends on what things are truly in Australia's national interest, but Australia's involvement in their strategic planning should no longer be taken for granted. And effectively, we can begin to disband the Five Eyes that way. Already, New Zealand has been a wrinkle in the Five Eyes. There's a saying that in the Five Eyes, New Zealand is the one that's winking, because New Zealand has actually been very resistant to a lot of the Five Eyes, runaway Five Eyes agenda. When I say runaway, I mean we now have Five Eyes finance ministers meeting, Five Eyes defence ministers meeting. It's not just like the Five Eyes as a controlling force in the last few years has been all encompassing, and New Zealand has actually resisted that. However, around the Ukraine thing, they have well and truly stepped up and towed the line with it, which is very disappointing. And a former New Zealand foreign minister has written an article speaking out quite forcefully against New Zealand giving up its sovereignty in this regard. But they have been a bit of an example for a while until this recent period. We should go in that direction. This is a question of sovereignty for Australia. And so the first thing is withdraw our agencies from the Five Eyes and then actually examine those agencies from the bottom up and see what purpose they actually serve. And to the ASIO agents that are watching, take that back to your bosses.
Thanks, Robbie. Now, this next question comes from Jeff in Tasmania. And bear with me, because it has a little bit of history here. I think it's very critical that he lays out. He says, at the approach of World War II, Australia faced the prospect of defending itself with the incalculable advantage of owning outright or cooperatively with allies its own discovered and unknown mineral resources, manufacturing capacity and capability, agricultural-based industries and infrastructure with which to prosecute its defence, including feeding itself and other allies' armies. We no longer have that advantage. Why don't our two main political parties raise the national security principle of long-term leases over Australia's strategic ports, such as Darwin and Newcastle, being approved, as well as other strategic national infrastructure closely associated to the Chinese Communist Party, as not being in Australia's national security nor national interest?
I have a quick answer to this and then see if anyone else wants to chip in. So first, I think I recognise the source of this question. My mate Jeff, who's either father or uncle, was a leader of the post-war of the wartime economic mobilisation in World War II, which was really impressive. And Jeff once gave me a copy of a of a newspaper from the time, a broadsheet newspaper, which detailed this amazing economic mobilisation, and it's really good. But I think the emphasis on the question is misplaced because for two reasons. First of all, the Citizens Party would never privatise any government assets, including ports. But the Liberals and the Labor Party do that. The problem is not who they privatise it to. The fact that I think the problem is privatisation. We should be guarding these assets jealously and developing them ourselves. But to go to Kingsley's point that he made earlier about Sri Lanka, the Chinese can't take our port away. It's still there as a port. And the Ukraine war has shown just how quickly governments can take back an asset from a hostile government if they choose to. The Russian government has lost all these assets around the world that the Americans have taken off them. If God forbid, the Citizens Party's, our best efforts fail and we're in a war with China, that port is no longer Chinese. It's our port. What are the Chinese, going to do? So that is not going to be our weakness, that the port is right now leased to China. And in fact, the port will be in better shape than it otherwise would be because it's been leased to China, because the Chinese company that leases it has a real intention to develop it, because the idea was it was to be part of this Belt and Road network. Our real vulnerability, Jeff and the viewers, and Jeff should appreciate this, is that all the other things that it takes to defend a country we don't have, such as our manufacturing. And in fact, we've done some work on this in the last couple of years because of the question of supply chain disruptions with COVID and how we can get our manufacturing back. And looked at some of the fascinating questions around the lead up to World War II. And one of the things that was done in the lead up to World War II under the munitions department, headed by a brilliant man named Mr. Layton, A.E. Layton, is that instead of Australia stockpiling a lot of weapons, what they did was they would set up these annexes to Australia's existing manufacturing factories. And the annexes would be an annex for the production of a particular high technology weapon or high technology from the time. But the purpose of the annex was to do production in that adjacent to the factory, but train the workers in that factory into the production of that particular weapon or that particular ammunition, such that if it was necessary in a war, that could be scaled up massively. It wasn't to stockpile lots and lots of them, but it was to have it there so it could be scaled up massively. And that is what we did in World War II. We were able to scale that up massively. We had a skilled workforce that knew how to manufacture these things, and we had a munitions directorate that made it happen. But manufacturing was the heart of our defence capability, not stockpiles of weapons, a manufacturing capacity. That is our greatest weakness in Australia. And these ideologues who are declaring war have no intention of bringing that back. If they won't bring it back under COVID, they're not going to bring it back for any reason. And that's a huge problem. Their idea of going to war is hook our taxpayer up to the US military industrial complex so that they have a blank check from us. And we'll buy their weapons and we'll fight their wars on their behalf.
Robbie, now I would be very keen to hear from our two participants from the Northern Territory on this question, what their thoughts on the purchase of the port in Darwin is. But before that, Craig Isherwood.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I just wanted to make a couple of comments on Jeff's observations, because he's absolutely right. During World War II, I mean, we actually built up an incredible capability under the Curtin-Chifley government to be able to prosecute a war. It was, at one point where basically the policy was to give our country away through the Brisbane line, a line drawn from Brisbane down through to Adelaide, and everything else north of that was to be ceded to the Japanese. That policy changed under Curtin, Chifley, MacArthur and so forth. And at that point, the Commonwealth Bank was utilised. It came under government direction and created an enormous capability through the direction of credit into the manufacturing sector, particularly in this case, the munitions areas and so forth, to defend ourselves. We were able to transform our internal economy to produce that was necessary to prosecute the war. And then the war ended. Chifley and Curtin wanted to enshrine the very process of what they did during the war through great economic post-war development projects. In other words, develop the same wealth in Australia by expanding out our huge manufacturing capabilities into large-scale water projects, including things like the Bradfield scheme and so forth. But then, unfortunately, through a whole series of different things, you know, Chifley was also trying to nationalise the banks because he recognised that control of credit necessarily had to remain under the control of the government and not under the private banking sector. But that was all wiped out with massive campaigns by the private banks. Chifley died, and then you had many years of Menzies, and the liberal economics came back in again. Menzies effectively rode the coattails of the economic development of the war up until a certain point. And then the next inflection point in Australian history was, of course, Whitlam. And why was Whitlam so targeted in this country is because of his policy of buy back the farm and do exactly what Jeff is suggesting. Let's take control of our natural resources. Let's build things. Let's value add our own natural resources. That didn't put us at odds with China back then. It put us at odds with the United States. They were the ones that shut us down. The CIA, their operations, these secret intelligence operations that Robbie was talking about. I mean, you know, ASIO and ACES are funded to the tune of $1.5 billion a year right now. Why do you need an intelligence agency funded that much, right? If you have a national sovereign outlook like the Kurt Chifley government or like even Whitlam, right? So Whitlam was attacked and brought down by the forces in the United Kingdom through the likes of Sir John Kerr, as we've documented, you know, the sacking through the Queen, and the CIA, because he tried to buy back the farm. He wasn't going to shut down existing companies that were already investing and working through Australia, but he said that if anything new comes up, that has to be owned and operated through Australian-owned entities. And we had all the finances, we had the finances and the facilities in place to fund all of that, but that represented a real threat to the not the Chinese. They didn't exist on the stage at that point, but the Brits and the UK, the Brits and the United States. So, you know, the issue of privatisation, as Robbie's pointed out, is the latest in a process of really not allowing the true sovereignty of our nation to exist. And it should be a collaborative process. Like today, moving forward, a Citizens Party government would say, well, we don't have these resources in our country. We don't have the ability to do this, but we want to enter into strategic partnerships with countries that do. Like, for example, high-speed rail. If we were to build high-speed rail in our country, then we would look towards China or Germany towards aspects of high-speed rail. I mean, it just makes sense to do that. But if you start to think of this adversarial thing, which is coming from an ideological point of view, which I mentioned before, where the UK and the US in particular see themselves as coming under threat, that their influence is going to be lost, they're going to lose their particular advantages in certain regions, then that all comes under attack and gets unwound. So, I mean, Jeff, very good question. It's a Citizens Party policy that we do buy back the farm, that we go and we develop our sovereign manufacturing capacity, that we do own our own resources and we develop them further because they do belong to the Australian people. And, you know, I mean, I heard a shuddering remark on the news tonight, you know, how we have to expect now, people, electricity prices are going to rise and they're going to go through the roof. You have to accept that. That's what we're being told now. Well, that's not true. Because if you accept the existing economic dogma, liberal dogma, then you're going to have to, you know, that's going to be true. But we don't have to accept that. And that's where the Citizens Party comes in. Thanks, Glenn.
Yes, Kingsley.
Yeah, there is an aspect of self-sufficiency when we come to our foreign policy and we start looking at our manufacturing and our defence capability. The more that it's homegrown, the less we're going to we're dependent on the outsourcing for our military capability to USA. So let's be more like Switzerland. We can do our own. Switzerland has a great manufacturing capability, and also in very highly specialized technological capabilities. So this is something we should develop. It's safer for us, and it weans us off a dependency with outside nations. We retain our sovereignty this way.
Thanks, Kingsley. We might move on to this next question then. This comes from New South Wales, from someone in Sydney. It is, what is the citizens... Sorry, we're good? Yep, okay, all right. This question is, what is the Citizens Party response if USA starts to support Taiwan moves towards a separate country? Yes, Russell.
You're muted, Russell.
There to unmute myself. Not speaking on behalf of the Citizens Party directly here, but or indirectly, is the thing I would say is, first up, Australians will not be cannon fodder, you know, for Uncle Sam if America starts to really agitate that Taiwan, you know, should declare its independence. I think that I'm pretty sure that something that the Citizens Party will will agree with me across the board, though, is that we should reiterate our 1972 communique that recognises the one China policy. In fact, Robbie interviewed a former diplomat recently, and who was involved in diplomacy back in that era, and he said that would go a long way to actually calming things down between us and China if we were to simply reiterate that that's still our policy. I mean, there seems to be a real inability anymore by our politicians to be able to put themselves in another person's shoes, you know, in terms of like their neighbours, you know, whether they're, you know, in terms of a country, another country. Now, just imagine if, you know, well, back in the 1940s and New Zealand was Imperial Japan, both islands are kind of about the same size, and they wanted to support Tasmania seceding from the mainland and then do military treaties with Tasmania. I mean, look, Taiwan is basically an aircraft carrier, a permanent aircraft carrier that's about 100 and something miles off the coast of China. It would be an absolute existential threat for China to embrace that in any way whatsoever. They know what the Americans are like. Look, let's be matter of fact about it. The Americans have been a warmongering nation for just about their entire existence as a nation. I think there's about 17 years where they haven't been at war. They've used nuclear weapons. They've agitated right across the world for conflicts. I mean, in 1948, they developed multiple plans for the absolute nuclear devastation of the Soviet Union. I think it was called Operation Drop Shot. You know, this sort of thing is real. It goes on, and China knows this about the United States. So there's no way that China, you know, can entertain that as a viable option, that they're going to have some American aircraft carrier, gigantic aircraft carrier, sitting, you know, 100 or so miles off their coast. You know, so, you know, we just need to reiterate our support as a nation for the one China policy, and really try hard to break free of this deputy sheriff role, this colonialist thinking that we have, and start diplomacy all over again. Start talking and getting rid of things like the Magnitsky Acts and things like that stop us from talking, and really go on the attack against the media that would come after us, right? They absolutely would. We know this. But we would have to go on the attack, almost like in Trumpian style, you know, love him or hate him. He's got many faults, but he certainly went after the media, went took it right up to them. And we'd have to do things like that as well to make sure that the truth breaks through to the Australian people. And that's my point of view. Thank you.
No, thank you, Russell. Very important points there that you've raised. I see Thong Sam Lee up in Darwin. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Glenn. One thing you have to realize is that Taiwan has always been part of China from ages, long time ago. They speak the same language, which is Mandarin. They look very Chinese. And if you go to Taiwan, you see temples, everything is very Chinese. So one thing the people should realize is Taiwan is part of China. Previously, before Taiwan, the name is called Formosa. Formosa is also part of this name change to Taiwan. So if people can remember that Taiwan is part of China, then if we practice of non-interference according to the United Nations Charter, then there will be peace. As Russell earlier said, the Americans, they are the troublemaker. So what I think we should do, or all the countries should do, is to unite against the United States, to stop him from being on the war path and helping the military industrial complex to get more money at the expense of the people. The people's welfare is very important. If the war starts and we have a proxy war, as shown in Ukraine and Russia, America would not help Australia, even though we are USA's closest ally. We have precedents about that, and that precedent is in Ukraine war. So Australia have to wake up, and we cannot rely on the Americans.
Thank you. Thank you, Thong. Kingsley, and then Robbie.
Thank you. I was at an Anzac dinner last weekend and Sunday, and we had Asian Anzacs there. There were Koreans, fought in the Korean War. We had Indians who fought in the First World and Second World War. We had Vietnamese there that fought in the Vietnam War, and we had Chinese that fought in the China War. And on our table, we had conversations about which is the best way to defend our country. And we do all agree that we need a deterrent. We need a strong military force. We need to be able to say to people, don't come near us. But there were shades of Gallipoli as we talked on the table. And one consensus that we did have, we don't want to be involved in fighting someone else's war. So no more proxy wars. And that was our feeling around the table. Thank you.
And I just,
yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, Glenn. Last year we transcribed and published a fascinating radio discussion between two Singaporean diplomats and real experts in their field. The former Foreign Minister George Gao, and the former Singaporean ambassador to the UN, Kishore Mahbubani. And they discussed this question of Taiwan in terms that I knew when I heard it, hardly any Australians have a clue about. And I just want to read you the relevant paragraph from that publication last year in our Australian Alert Service, where, it is Yeo. George Yeo told told about the consequences of Henry Kissinger's negotiations with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. And he said Kissinger has repeatedly recounted his conversation with Zhou Enlai on US-China relations, and how whenever they explored other areas, Zhou Enlai came back to Taiwan, and there was agreement only because the United States accepted that there was one China. So that is bedrock. It is not a card. If you play the bedrock as if it is a card, then the structure upon which an edifice is built can rapidly collapse. Now, it may be that subsequent administrations have forgotten or have changed their minds. So from China's perspective, there must be no ambiguity. They have made it very clear that even if it means war, so be it. In other words, if Australians don't appreciate the whole basis of China's opening up and establishing relations with the West was the agreement that Russell referred to, Australia made in 1972 and the United States made, that we accept there as one China. And we're now messing with that, and we're encouraging silly politicians in China to declare independence, knowing that is a guaranteed trigger for war. But we're the ones changing. And what we have to be extremely conscious of is that China said from the beginning, this is their red line. And I hope we've learned a lesson from the Ukraine fiasco. Russia said for 30 years that's their red line, and they've proved it. Well, this is China's red line. And Peter Dutton last year admitted or revealed in the Australian newspaper he read the book of the American strategist Eldridge Colby, who's written this book called The Strategy of Denial, which basically says that America should encourage Taiwan to declare independence. So China does invade and then loses support because it does initiate an invasion. And then America can establish the proxy war that it wants to wear China down. Not only has Dutton read that book, his rhetoric is all based on that strategy. And he's committed Australia, at least rhetorically. We don't have to follow through on what he said, but he has said that Australia would also join Taiwan under those conditions, and we would also be a proxy. Be very clear from that quote that this is a recipe for war. No ifs, no buts, no maybes, and we need to do everything in our power to stop it.
Thanks, Robbie. The next question comes from Greg in Queensland. It moves off the specific subject of China, but onto the question, I'll just read it, how about that? How much influence are foreign entities like the World Economic Forum, Davos, the UN, and USA having on the running of the country? Who are the politicians, bureaucrats, public figures, industry leaders, etc., who are being influenced, controlled by these globalist entities? Why aren't they held accountable for treason?
Treason's pretty strong. It's not automatically treason. Look, this is, I would hope tonight's discussion has put some of that in perspective. A lot of people around Australia have been focused on that in the last few years. If you weigh up what's worse, a 16-week lockdown that you think is part of a great reset dictated to by the World Economic Forum, or war with China, I don't know what your worst scenario is, but the latter is my worst scenario. That there's been, I'm not trying to downplay the former, but this is a very, very, very serious issue, a much more serious issue. And a lot of the politicians that are telling you what you want to hear and claiming that they're standing up for Australia's sovereignty because they criticise the World Economic Forum are aggressively talking us into a war with China. The way Peter Dutton's talking, he might announce conscription next week. Don't rule it out. They seem the draft may be back. He said we are preparing for war. Under war conditions, you will lose every right you ever thought you had. There are no civil rights in a war. The war effort comes first and foremost, always. So I do think people need to take that quite seriously. This, in my view, I'm representing myself, but somewhat also the perspective of the Citizens Party. This trumps that concern massively. That said, the specifics of the World Economic Forum and those organisations is they can say what they like. They can't dictate one thing to Australia. They promote agendas. They become talk fests. They invite politicians to come to them and discuss their ideas, etc., etc. And a lot of politicians go. In fact, I suspect Klaus Schwab leverages the World Economic Forum to give himself more respectability. Donald Trump attended the World Economic Forum in 2020. In fact, he actually, in Donald Trump's speech to the World Economic Forum in 2020, it was a fascinating and a very good speech where he talked about the cathedral at Florence and the technology that went into making the fantastic dome as an example of human creativity. And that was delivered at the World Economic Forum. Donald Trump is not regarded as a globalist. What comes out of some of these things, when they become forums for certain agendas, is they're trying to convince the politicians of each country to pass that agenda in their own country. And until it is passed in the parliaments of each country, it's not law. And that's one of the reasons the Citizens Party is not as focused on this as a lot of other groups right now, because we know the issue is not what happens in Switzerland, the World Economic Forum or at the UN or whatever. It's what happens in Parliament House. And that's where we can intervene and fight those. If a bad law arises, we can fight it. And in 2019, the Citizens Party played a very important leading role in stopping the cash ban legislation in Australia. And the erosion of cash and getting rid of cash is generally part of this, move towards this digital future, etc. We stopped it. We successfully stopped it. That was just going to be waved through. We stopped it. We collaborating with other groups, but we definitely stopped it. So that's why we focus on organising political movement in Australia, getting people engaged in the political process, because you can intervene. And that forum in Canberra is much more important than whatever happens in Davos in Switzerland.
Thanks, Robbie. Anne?
Yeah, I'm probably just going to build a bit on what I said before. And I think something that we can't rule out is we've got a perfect storm of two things coming together, or one's driving the other, and that is the global financial crisis. Because, what happened in 2008 was just bailed out with billions, trillions of dollars have been poured into the system to try and keep the Western, the Anglo-American system propped up. And the threat to that is what China is leading, with the idea of collaboration between countries, building infrastructure and focusing on the physical productive economy. So, it's hard to go to war if it's a bit like you can't have an argument if you haven't got someone else to argue with. We need to shift the focus onto the direction of where we want Australia to go, to work towards peace and economic development and collaboration, rather than allow, I know you can't ignore it, the fact that all of this rhetoric is happening and there is a deliberate intention to get Australia tied up in these proxy wars on behalf of the United States and the UK. But from our point of view, is it, and maybe Robbie, you might like to have something to say on this, because how can we shift that focus or get the people that are listening to this call to get involved in growing the idea of peace through economic development, and how Australia can participate in that. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, and do you want to take that, Robbie, or I think the next question lends itself to the same subject.
Just quickly,
Yeah.
Because I think Australians naturally want to support a lot of our ideas. Actually, we get the more Australians know us, the more support we get. We have a lot of positive ideas to actually do that for the country, but we run up against this prejudice that so many Australians turn around and say, yeah, but I can't support you because you're pro-China. So one of our biggest challenges is to actually take on that prejudice, because it's a block. And we have to take on that prejudice with the truth. And that's what, I would hope people have learned from this discussion tonight, and actually forcefully combat it. Our party in this office, where we are in Melbourne, and there's some of us here present tonight, like Craig and Anne and I, are part of the morning meeting of our full-time staff. And we took a conscious decision in 2020 when this just erupted in the most extreme terms, because on the back of COVID, etc., and all the accusations about Wuhan, etc., we knew that the Chinese community, there were reports of Chinese people being assaulted in the streets for being Chinese, right? Such was the climate that was, and the fear and the rage that was out there. And we knew that we, as an Australian political party that doesn't have the ties to China we're accused of having, we're a patriotic Australian political party. We don't take money from the Chinese government or Chinese business people or anyone in China. We don't take money from them. We were entirely funded Australian political party. We knew we were in a unique position of responsibility to take it on because we knew what the truth was. And I would encourage more people not to see that as something that they're prepared to overlook in the Citizens Party in order to continue their support, recognise how important it is, and join us in seeing this reality of war and helping us fight to step back from it. Because if we can get Australians over that, the solutions are there. It's a very positive agenda that we have. We can turn this country around. Now, I just one last thing quickly. I just did an interview with CGTN, the Chinese television station, and I told them what Australia could look like if we didn't have this. We had this wonderful collaborator who died in 2009, Professor Lance Endersby, has this brilliant idea of a high-speed freight rail line from Melbourne to Darwin, not up through Queensland, or where's the map behind me there? Not up through there, but up through the middle. Sorry, I'll stop doing that. Go through the middle to Darwin, open up the inland, be able to get fresh produce grown in the southern states to Darwin within 24 hours, connected to high-speed shipping, in which we're already a world leader, thanks to Austell in Perth and Incat in Tasmania. We could be getting Australian-produced goods from an Australian food bowl that we could expand with water projects into Jakarta and into Singapore and into Hong Kong and into Shanghai within 2 to 3 days max. We could become a much bigger food bowl for the whole of Asia. We could have an incredibly positive trading relationship with those countries by building that kind of infrastructure here. It would benefit Australia immensely. It would benefit Asia immensely. That's the sort of perspective, and we would love what the Land Bridge Company does to the Port of Darwin to make that even to facilitate that even more. That's the sort of perspective we could have as a country. Instead, we're jumping at our shadow. We're looking to the other side of the world, the US and the UK, for our security, scared of the region, absolutely scared of the region, and we're not developing ourselves to the potential we could. And that's what's got to change. If we did develop ourselves, the sky's the limit here, and we would be a much wealthier country as a result.
Yeah, can I just make a couple of comments here, Glenn? I think it's important because, when we look at these issues, the Citizens Party has always looked at them through historical eyes. We don't look at them through the populist rants that happen these days by people who have not studied our own history. And we know that we have a rich Republican history in our country, right? And it goes back particularly in the period of the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, when we had a lot of Americans coming out of here that were very much part of the whole Lincoln tradition. They came out here for the gold rush, so there was commercial reasons involved. But at that particular time, Australia was at a crossroads, and the question was whether we were going to become the United States of Australia in the tradition of the true American Republic, not this garbage that we've got now, but the original American Republic, the idea of for, of, and by the people, pursuit of liberty, and all that sort of thing. At that particular time, when we first started as a Citizens Party, we didn't have a clue who we were as a movement, as a party. So we spent a lot of time in the 90s with employing people to go into the National Archives in Canberra and find out who are we as a nation. And we discovered this rich Republican history, and it centered around one particular guy, or a number of these people. And we had our own Republican poets, people like Charles Harper, but we also had an incredible guy by the name of John Dunmore Lang. He was a reverend who used to preach and so forth, and a Scottish preacher. But what was really significant about him is that he stood up for the Chinese of that time who were being vilified. There was a poll tax that he initially supported but then opposed because there was a lot of effective slave labour in terms of the Chinese population inside Australia at that time. And the poll tax was designed at that time to stop Chinese from coming to Australia. A tax, obviously, to make it too expensive for them to come. And he fought vigorously to get that reversed, stop that sort of thing happening. He fought and he got it reversed. In 1878, at his funeral, 500 Chinese marched calling John Dunmore Lang our great liberator. And he also very interestingly made the comment and foresaw that at some point it was likely that Northern Australia would be inhabited by Aborigines, Malays and Chinese, which populations he proposed to elevate by means of European education and extension of equal rights and privileges to all. This was 1870s. And you have to say, well, what stopped that from happening? Well, there was an operation take place in the 1880s, 1890s to give us responsible government, right? Which was the idea of giving us a constitution crafted in the British Foreign Office to stop us going down the role of becoming a republic with these sorts of ideas embodied within the population. That was actually part of the population at that time. So that's what the Citizens Party is representing, even now in 2022. That same spirit is that which we can tap into for those Australians that really want to see our country become sovereign, first and foremost, but a principled sovereign country first and foremost. And I think that this is the real issue for us. We're not a republic. We're a self-governing colony. We're somewhat autonomous, but not really. Not when you see the sorts of power structures that govern us and tell us what to do, right, and how we're going to run our affairs. So this is the battle that we've yet to have of becoming truly sovereign as a nation, in the sense of being able to establish our own national bank, our own banking structures, and it's the same struggle everywhere for every country. And as soon as you start to oppose that, you'll get the sort of a treatment that is being foisted on any country that opposes this new global economic order.
The treatment we may see the Solomon Islands get very soon.
That's correct.
Thanks, Craig. Kingsley.
Australia has the opportunity to create strategic partnerships around the Pacific. I mean, if we employ the assets that we could generate through a national public bank, we could invest and put into place infrastructure across Micro-Indonesia and the Pacific to develop those countries and increase our trade and our strategic friendship with those countries. We should not avoid those opportunities that are there before us. The most powerful form of foreign policy is to help your neighbour, but don't run gunboats over them. Put your hand out and help them. It's a win-win situation. Yes, we can create the land bridge what China's done. We can do exactly the same in the Pacific and the South Pacific and Micro-Indonesia. For instance, we don't want to miss out opportunities like New Guinea had taken up recently. They built a highway across the Stanley Owen Ranges to connect the east to the west. That's going to open up the country. But it wasn't done with the support from Australia. We need to be involved with those countries directly and don't let those competitive advantages be taken by, let's say, outside groups like China. We can do it. We can get in there into the act and do it with great effect for ourselves, and our national security comes along with it. It will grow with that as well.
Thanks, Kingsley. This strikes me as a good opportunity also to mention that on this YouTube channel, you'll be able to find an interview that I gave last year to Shane Condon of Project Iron Boomerang, and he echoed that very point, that China is seeking trade and we should be there. Like, war doesn't benefit anyone in this respect, but we could be there as a world leader in steel production, right up there in the top 4, and with the efficiencies and the infrastructure we have, we could compete with China as the major steel producer for the world. And that's something that he advocates for, as do we, to have those partnerships and these initiatives with our neighbours, good neighbourly relations. So just going to jump across here to a question that's come in from Roger in Queensland. Regarding Julian Assange, I feel that Australian Julian Assange and American Ed Snowden are of kindred spirits, like brothers at arms, both whistleblowers revealing the truth about war crimes and are suffering the ultimate consequences. In the case of Assange, what is the solution to bring him home? Or is there anything else you can compare or impart?
I have a comparison to make first, which I think hopefully people will find interesting. And maybe you can help me out with the name, Kingsley, but there's an Australian journalist at CGTN who has been arrested and detained for the last 18 months. Do you remember her name?
I think it's Li Chen.
Li Chen, yeah. So we don't know the circumstances why. There's another Australian detained up there in China who is being accused of espionage, and given that he has a history, given that he has a background as a spy, there's probably some grounds for that. But the Li Chen case is very unknown, and it seems very sad. She's got 2 children here in Melbourne, and they haven't seen their mum for 18 months, and there doesn't seem any prospect of that case being resolved for now. And of course, it's used to make China seem really authoritarian and bad. But I think it's a case of what Australia has done to itself by destroying its relationship with China, because our government has no foundation with the Chinese government to actually advocate for this woman's release and try and get something resolved there in the background. They have none, right? And so she's and that's without knowing the case. I've told you what I know about it, and it just seems sad. And of course, it's periodically reported in the Australian press to paint China as this. Robbie, just say Robbie. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, you're back. Yep, you dropped.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's her. But Julian Assange is another Australian who has been detained longer. We know what he's been detained for. We absolutely know what he's been detained for. He blew the whistle on our allies' war crimes. And our government absolutely has a foundation with the governments that are detaining him and are trying to extradite him to advocate on his behalf. And in fact, as I've said publicly in a few recent forums, last year I got to meet one of his lawyers, Jennifer Robinson, and I asked her out of curiosity, because it was February last year, and Donald Trump had just left the White House and Biden had been sworn in, and everyone had gossiped for 2 months that Trump might have pardoned Assange. And I said, do you think that was true? And she said, absolutely, if the Australian government had have advocated for it. If that's all it would have taken, the Australian government saying, we want him, cut it out, release that guy, and he would have been out. And they didn't, right? They didn't. And he, you know, all he did was expose real high-level international corruption and war crimes by our side. That's what he did. He brought a degree of transparency to international relations that had never existed before. Made a lot of people uncomfortable, etc. But that's what he did as a journalist. He's an Australian Walkley award-winning journalist. And for that, he is being made an example of by the Anglo-American establishment. And we are letting it happen. So when you hear about Li Chen in China, and whatever, like I said, we don't know about the case, but when you hear about that, understand that we have damaged our ability to help her because we don't have a relationship anymore and we have trashed it. But this is a relation. There's another journalist who we could be helping, and absolutely helping if our government, and we could get him free tomorrow, I believe, if our government demanded it. And that's why we went on a mobilisation just before Easter, up until last week, to demand Priti Patel that get people like Barnaby Joyce, who's public advocated for Assange, etc., who's now the Deputy Prime Minister, get on the phone and demand Priti Patel, the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, to let him go. Don't let the extradition go ahead, and let him go. That will work, but only if our government does it.
All right. Would anyone else like to take that question on Julian Assange? I think that was well answered there, Robbie. Otherwise, I've got another one. Let's. This next question is actually specific. Is being specifically asked to the candidates from the Northern Territory. It's from Stan in Catherine, who says, I'm keen to hear how our candidates in the Northern Territory think about the risk of having so many American troops stationed in the Northern Territory. Does this make us more secure or less secure? Peter? Just make sure you unmute yourself there. Hit the button. Be down. There we go. You gotcha.
Okay, yeah. To my mind, less secure. You've got to keep in mind that the whole of the territory's only got a population of about 250,000 people, and you're getting a large percentage of American military forces coming in that seem to be putting a lot of infrastructure in out around Gun Point. They've built a road with numerous millions of dollars to nowhere, and they're denying it's anything to do with the American bases. But old rumours from a few years ago, they were sort of talking strongly of it around town here, that was going to be the case. That was going to be a big military base there. And other areas, you've got Delamere Down, weapons running down around out in Catherine there. Yeah, I think it makes us more vulnerable. As you build up infrastructure for military, you're going to get paint a bigger and bigger target on us. Yeah, it's not. I can't see it turning around. They're really starting to push. There's a lot of sort of work starting to come up, but mainly in those sort of areas for military infrastructure. Bits and pieces that seem to be happening. Oh, that's where the money is. Everywhere else is pretty flat. Yep, that's
Peter.
Really on that.
In terms of other observations of infrastructure up there in the context of tonight's discussion, in terms of the national defence, what would you say has to be done?
Well, if you start, like, they're talking about building another harbour within Darwin Harbour, put another port facility. I don't know. That's just because Landbridge has got the existing port facilities. That's only come up in the last couple of months. So that's a big job to go and build where they're going to do that. So you've got a concentration within, because you've got two big gas plants in that area as well. So you have there, you know, they get bombed, they're going to wipe out a fair bit of area around them. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. It's just they just push. This idiot bloody rules based order that they're putting out that we've got to abide by because they say so. And this is what's happening with Ukraine. It's really, in my mind, the fact that Russia and China are standing up to them is actually in our interest that they do that, because we aren't in any position to stand up to this at this point in time. But we need to go down that line where we reject all this bloody warmongering and stuff. But it's pretty entrenched there at the moment, as you say, Aspie and all those. You see the idiots in there. Well, you know, I think, well, what's going to happen? Because at the moment we're heading down that path of nuclear war in Ukraine, and is it going to stop there? No, it's going to. As soon as that starts, where does it stop?
Thanks, Peter. Thong?
Thank you for letting me speak. I'm very emotional and very passionate about the expansion of the American bases in Darwin or in the territory. And I'll show you why. As long as the American treat us as lapdog or is a subservient servant, a lapdog like my dog here, this is the Chihuahua. So as long as America treat Australia as a lapdog, we are powerless. So we have to stand up and say no more American bases. Go home. The history of American bases in Japan and in Philippines have shown that they will not only bring in expansion of industries to the local people, but worse is the morality. How many sex workers were there? How many rapes were there done by the American soldiers? And when times of war, if we already have proxy wars, who will be the first location to be bombed? It will be Alice Springs, the center of the American communications center. So we need to forget about giving us extra work. We don't need it. As when there's a proxy war going up, I'm sure China will send one of its supersonic missiles over to Darwin or to Alice Springs and bomb the hell out of us. So I'm very, very of the opinion that the Americans should go home. Do not set up base in any part of Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Thong. This will be the final question this evening, and I encourage everyone watching, thank you for getting this far into it. We've been going for over 2 hours now. If you have questions, keep them coming in. We will answer them. ask@citizensparty.org.au. This final question comes from Joanne in New South Wales. When world leaders are not happy with the foreign policy and actions of another country, they accuse that country of not adhering to the rules-based order. What rules and whose order? How many countries determine these rules and what principle are they based on? How do they compare with the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which was a series of treaties largely responsible for ending the European wars of religion?
Well, they're the opposite. The 1648 Treaty of Westphalia actually laid the foundation stone for modern international law and the principle of national sovereignty, the principle of non-interference in another country's affairs were enshrined in those treaties. And I remember when Tony Blair, one of the architects of the modern rules-based order, advocated for the bombing of Serbia that Russell referenced, he actually said, he attacked the Westphalian Treaty, right, and said we have to move away from that and create this new doctrine of international law, which he called the responsibility to protect. But then that was actually the justification for what was done in Libya. And look at the results of that. When the Iraq invasion happened in 2003, Henry Kissinger wrote an op-ed in one of the American newspapers and said, the era of Westphalia is over. And what he was, because he was making the point that what the Americans and British and Australians had done there is created a doctrine for themselves outside of the foundations of international law to justify their own actions. But then those countries have turned around ever since and invented this term, the rules-based order, to criticize what Russia, how Russia and China have been acting on the world stage, except the Russians and the Chinese come back and say, hang on, buddy, we adhere to international law as expressed in the UN Charter. That is international law. What is this rules-based order of which you speak? And one example that we use is the farce of the United States sailing its aircraft carrier groups through the South China Sea in order to enforce the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and free movement, the principle of free movement, of which the United States is not a signatory to the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. It's enforcing a law that it doesn't agree to, because it makes its own rules for itself. And Australia is no better. Even though we are a signatory to it, we wouldn't let East Timor take us to The Hague under that convention when we spied on them using ACIS in order to steal their oil. Yet we turn around and attack the Chinese and the Russians for not abiding by the rules and norms of our rules-based order. We have come to refer to it as our rules-based order, and that's how the rest of the world sees it. There's a handful of countries are saying, we make the rules here. This is not international law. We have this separate system of norms and conventions that we claim constitute a set of rules, and we decide what they are. We can change them at whim, and we'll attack you if you don't abide by it. So I do urge people, you should, listen to the actual, it never gets reported properly in the Australian media, but if you read the transcripts of what the foreign ministers and the presidents of countries like Russia and China say on this subject, they always refer back to actual international law as their mainstay for what governs their actions. And it's a very different approach, and it's the right approach.
Well, I wanted to thank everyone, the 7 candidates present, Anne, Lawler and Kingsley from New South Wales, Peter and Thong from Northern Territory, Russell from South Australia, Craig and Robbie from Victoria. For those watching online, again, I can only emphasise, get in touch, go to our website, look at the profiles of the candidates. Up on screen right now, you'll see all of our Senate teams and House of Reps candidates for the country, and get involved in those campaigns. We need boots on the ground. We need volunteers out there spreading this message. True sovereignty, true strength of Australia lies in the economic solutions that we have laid forth and having good neighbour policies. And with that, I say good evening and thanks for tuning in, and look out for the next alert of our next live broadcast and our other videos. Good night.